From a young age, I learned that a modern princess isn't born with golden crowns, but with expectations. They expect you to smile without showing your teeth, to speak without raising your voice, to exist without causing a stir. And I was trained to perfection in this subtle art of erasing myself with elegance. As a daughter of the Daragon family, one of the most influential and traditional dynasties in the country, I was presented in magazine columns as the jewel of the American dynasty, as if my existence were merely a living frame for the empire built by generations. I grew accustomed to seeing my face in headlines and my decisions written by other hands. From 15, I knew who I was supposed to marry. From 18, I was swept into alliance dinners where everything seemed to smile, except the eyes. I was respected, admired, even envied, but never truly known. And the cruelest part was that I didn't know myself either. I lived trapped in a carefully constructed version of me, shaped by speeches, diplomatic invitations, and rehearsed smiles. Until the day the improbable happened. A charity event, just another among many, with the same faces and the same toasts. And in the midst of the monotony that composed my life like a frozen painting, he appeared, Liam Hayes, a name that meant nothing to the world around me. And yet, when I looked at him, it felt as if every wall surrounding me had cracked. Not because of his appearance, not because of a dramatic gesture, but because of the absence of everything that defined my world. He was free, and for someone like me, that was more dangerous than any temptation. Because freedom, when you've never had it, is like a breath of fresh air after years underwater. And one breath, just one, is enough to make you realize you can't live without it anymore. I started seeking him with my eyes before I even admitted it to myself. At first they were fleeting glances, then slightly calculated steps, nothing that would draw attention. After all, mastering one's impulses is a skill women like me learn early, especially when all that's expected of us is restraint. But inside, something in me had already crumbled. I craved his presence with a hunger that couldn't be satisfied by speeches or logic. It was as if my soul, which had lived on scraps until then, had tasted something true for the first time. I began to notice when he arrived, to pick out the tone of his voice amidst dozens, and strangely, I envied his freedom. The way he moved, spoke, didn't apologize for being whole. Liam didn't belong to my world, and perhaps because of that, he became increasingly essential to my own. It took days to muster the courage to approach him, not because I wasn't allowed. No one forbade me anything, but because I knew the weight a single gesture from me could carry. A comment, a smile out of place, and everything around me would ignite with questions. In my life, everything has consequences. A name like mine carries entire reputations in the subtext of every move. But what I felt for him wasn't fleeting or platonic. It was a constant spark, a warmth under my skin, a presence that settled even when he wasn't nearby. So when I finally spoke to him, it was like crossing an invisible border within myself. It was at one of the Foundation's events, during a mundane conversation circle. I approached with practiced ease, but inside I was trembling. He looked into my eyes and listened, not out of obligation, but with genuine attention. And when he responded, it was with a calm firmness that dismantled any barriers I was still trying to maintain. There was no excessive charm, no enchanted words. There was truth, and that's when everything changed. We began to exchange more than words. We started sharing silences, glances, small smiles that bloomed when no one else was watching. And even though it was still innocent, I knew I was breaking rules that were never spoken aloud, but were etched into the hallways of my home, the columns of magazines, the subtext of every dinner with my parents. The more I got to know him, the harder it was to keep pretending I cared about what had once defined me. Designer clothes began to feel heavy. Commitments started to suffocate. People with their forced smiles and disguised interests became empty mirrors. And I found myself torn between who I'd always been and who I could be if I had the courage. But courage, I discovered, doesn't arrive with fanfare. It creeps in first as discomfort, then as desire, until it becomes a decision. And at that point in the story, even without saying it aloud, I had already chosen. Maybe out of impulse, maybe out of instinct, or maybe because deep down, I knew no one can live chained to their own last name forever. And if the world thought I was a princess, I was about to discover that my crown was never on my head, but in what I'd have to lose to become free. The end came before I even realized the beginning had passed. There was no clear line, no warning. It was a sequence of small ruptures like stitches unraveling in silence. One day I woke up and realized I could no longer breathe in that world. Family meetings became velvet prisons. Political dinners felt like theater where everyone knew the script except me. My engagement, announced in society columns with meticulously chosen photos, felt like a sentence disguised as a promising future. He, the chosen one, was polite, handsome, impeccable, and utterly incapable of touching my soul. Beside him, I was a perfectly framed portrait. Beside Liam, I felt alive, with all the imperfections, all the uncertainties, but alive. It was at a gala, one of those that demand porcelain smiles and dresses that cost more than most earn in a year, that everything broke for good. I saw him there, among the volunteers helping backstage, wearing a simple shirt and a calm expression, as if nothing could taint him with the venom running through that environment. Our eyes met, and for a moment the entire ballroom vanished. No words, just a look full of pain, restrained desire, longing, and above all, truth. Too much truth to fit inside the bubble I lived in. That same night, back home, I took off the dress and let it fall to the floor like a skin that no longer belonged to me. I looked at my reflection, without makeup, without jewels, without the weight of my last name. For the first time, I saw myself truly, and I realized I was no longer the woman everyone expected me to be. I didn't belong to that world anymore. I didn't want a throne. I wanted ground. I wanted hands intertwined, a look that said, "I see you," without needing words. I wanted Liam, and above all, I wanted myself, even if it cost everything. The next morning wasn't cinematic. There was no symbolic sunlight streaming through the window, no air of relief for having made the right choice. There was silence, a thick silence, the kind that settles inside you when life suddenly changes direction and there's no going back. I sat on the edge of the bed for too long, staring at the phone on the nightstand as if it were a bomb about to explode. I knew that somewhere on that screen a flurry of messages awaited, from advisors, my mother, the fiancé, maybe the press. But in that moment, everything felt distant. The world's voices became a dull hum. Inside me, there was only an uncomfortable, brutal certainty. The path I'd chosen offered no return. The first person to approach me was my mother. With the sharp delicacy of someone who knows how to wield words like scalpels, she said everything that couldn't be said publicly. That my reputation was at risk, that society columnists were restless, that my fiancé had called twice and left polite but firm messages. She didn't mention Liam, not directly. But he was in every pause, every restrained look of censure, every meticulously calculated sentence. It was as if I'd committed a crime no one dared name. And in a way, that's exactly what it was. I'd committed the crime of wanting to be free, of desiring something outside the script. And in our world, that was unforgivable. That day, I tried to write, to organize my thoughts into words, as I always did when life slipped through my fingers. But all that came was raw, disorganized emotion, burning too fiercely to fit into coherent sentences. I wasn't regretful, but I wasn't at peace either. It was as if I were between two worlds, the one I left and the one that hadn't yet welcomed me. An empty space where loneliness was almost physical, and Liam, though ever present in my mind, was now a name that brought not only desire, but consequence. I knew that if I continued, everything around me would collapse, and yet there was no turning back. That night, I went out alone. No security, no driver, no protocol. Just me and the sound of my own steps. I needed to see him. Not out of impulse, but out of an urgent need to exist in front of someone who saw me as a woman, not an heir to an empire. When I arrived, he looked at me as if he wasn't sure he could believe it. And I, standing before him, finally felt whole. I didn't say I was scared. He saw it. I didn't say I was confused. He felt it. We just sat side by side, and the silence between us was more intimate than any declaration. It was the beginning of everything, the beginning of us, and also the start of the fall. The days that followed were like walking on shards, sharp, unpredictable, inevitable. The world that once applauded me began to close like a fist around my name. First came questions disguised as concern. Are you okay, Diana? Do you need time away from the media? Are you sure you're making the right choices? Then, invitations began to vanish, silent and coordinated like polite retaliation. Society columns dropped me from praise to venomous subtext. Even the air in the Darragon mansion felt denser, as if the furniture judged me for still being there, still breathing. My father didn't yell. He never yells. His silence was always the most effective way to wound me. When he sat across from me in the library, hands clasped and eyes fixed on mine, I already knew what was coming. He said my behavior was compromising the family's image, that sacrifices had been made for generations to maintain the dignity of the name, that I could still correct the course before it was too late. And there, facing the man who raised me with such rigor and pride, I realized he didn't see me. He saw only the daughter icon, the link between alliances, the golden piece on an ancient board. I took a deep breath, and with the steadiest voice I could muster, I replied that there was nothing wrong with the course, except that for the first time, he wasn't in control. When I returned to Liam, I was shattered, not by doubt, but by exhaustion, by knowing that with every step beside him, I was giving something up. But he welcomed me with open arms, as someone who understands without needing words. He didn't offer promises. He didn't try to convince me everything would be easy. He just said, "We'll go together." And that was the most powerful sentence I'd ever heard. We were starting from zero, he with his simple, purpose-filled life, me trying to discover who I was without titles, without parties, without the golden frame. For the first time, I washed my own clothes, cooked something not from a pre-signed menu, walked the street without security watching, and strangely, I felt richer than I'd ever been. But the city doesn't forget easily. The whispers started, the stares in markets, the ironic smiles from some familiar faces. People I'd helped climb in life now looked at me with pity, as if I'd fallen. And that, Liam knew, hurt me. On one of the hardest nights, he held my face in his hands and said, "They're not laughing at you, Diana. They're laughing because they don't understand how someone like you had the courage to leave the cage." And that's when I understood. I hadn't lost anything. I was breaking free. The final break didn't come with scandal. It came with a thick envelope, delivered by a messenger from the very house where I was born. Inside were coldly organized documents, the formal renunciation of properties in my name, the severance of the trust fund, the removal of my seat on the family's philanthropic foundation. No letter, no handwritten note, just the legal formality that ends a cycle with the cutting elegance of someone making it clear there's no return. When I finished reading, my hands trembled, but not with regret. It was the tremor of grief. Because yes, I had lost something, not the money, nor the privileges, but the last thread tying me to an identity forged by others. Liam didn't say anything that day. He hugged me from behind as I stared out the window of the small apartment. That was now ours. His silence was complete, and within it was everything I needed. I cried. Not for the jewels, the carpets, the torn invitations, but for the little girl who once wanted so badly to be loved that she molded herself until she no longer knew where the role ended and the soul began. I said goodbye to her that night, with silent tears and a sigh that seemed to have been trapped in my chest for years. And when dawn broke, I was no longer a princess. I was just Diana. For the first time, the days that followed were a raw restart. We ate what we could afford. We assembled second-hand furniture. We got lost in bills, laughed at our own mess. Simple life isn't easy. It demands resilience, creativity, humility. But there's a dignity in it that no gala ballroom ever taught me. At night, we lay together without masks, without filters, without the obligation to perform. And in the dark, with his breathing close to mine, I felt a kind of peace no amount of money could buy. There was still fear, yes, still longing, but above all, there was truth. When the news began to spread, the rebel heiress, the princess, turned commoner, I no longer trembled. Headlines didn't define me anymore. People talked, judged, distorted, and still, I moved forward, one step at a time, beside a man who never asked me to be someone else, who never wanted me for status, but for essence. I understood then that true love doesn't shine on a stage. It reveals itself in the everyday, in silent complicity, in the courage to rebuild your story with bare hands. And when my name was officially removed from the Darragon Foundation's records, something inside me rose. Because in that exact moment when I was erased from the lineage, I was born again. The first months of the new life were like learning to walk again. Every step, a discovery, every stumble, a lesson. There was no longer a staff around me. No, one to open doors, schedule appointments, or protect my image from slip-ups. Everything was done by us now. Mornings came with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the low hum of the radio, while Liam read the news with half-closed eyes from sleeping little but smiling anyway. There was dust in the corners of our apartment, some tight bills on the table, but there was also something I'd never known, belonging. There, in that small, imperfect space, I felt I was finally part of my own life. I started teaching critical reading at a community library. At first, few knew who I was. Some recognized my face from old reports, but they soon let it go. It didn't matter where I came from, only what I brought. I spoke with teens who'd never been heard, read stories with women carrying raw pain, and discovered that my voice, once polished for perfect speeches, gained more meaning when it trembled with sincere emotion. Every word exchanged, there was like a new brick in the rebuilding of who I was becoming. And the more I spoke, the more I listened. I realized my greatest power was never the title, but empathy. Liam, meanwhile, made his name grow with effort and consistency. He didn't seek recognition, but he earned it anyway. He worked with wood, creating furniture with soul, pieces that seemed to hold stories in every groove. Watching his hands turn something rough into beauty was, for me, the purest reflection of everything we were living. He'd helped me rebuild without ever trying to shape me. And that, in a world where everyone wanted to fit me into a mold, was love in its rarest form. There were hard days, of course, of moments when the longing for who I'd been still knocked at the door. Not for the ostentation, but for the absence of some affections, familiar voices that chose silence as their response. But now I knew how to cry. I knew how to embrace pain without letting it define me. And beside Liam, even on cloudy days, there was always enough light to keep going. It was there, in the midst of a simple, meaningful routine, that I realized I hadn't fled a palace. I'd chosen a different kingdom, where the throne was freedom and the crown, true love. Over time, my story began to echo beyond the walls of our small life. First timidly, an old college friend who saw me at a literary workshop, an independent journalist who recognized me at a community event. Then came an article, "The Daragon Daughter Who Traded a Throne for Freedom." I thought it would be just another attempt by the media to reduce me to a romantic or provocative headline. But to my surprise, that piece wasn't cruel. It was human, written with respect, empathy, truth. And that opened a crack. People started reaching out not to judge, but to understand. Women carrying the weight of unchosen legacies. Young people suffocated by expectations. Men who'd given up on themselves trying to meet the world's demands. Real people, like I'd become. That's when I realized my story wasn't just mine. It was a mirror, a seed. And for the first time, I agreed to speak publicly. Not as the renegade heiress, but as a woman. I was invited to lecture at universities, communities, social projects. I spoke about choices, about losses, about the cost of freedom and the value of love. Not the romantic, idealized love sold in movies, but the kind that stays when the glamour fades, when everything fails, when only the essential remains. I spoke about Liam, about what I found in his eyes that no gala ballroom gave me, the feeling of being seen, accepted, enough. And each time I shared this, I felt something bloom inside me. It wasn't fame, it was meaning. Meanwhile, Liam grew in his craft. His pieces began to be sought after by people who didn't know him through me, but for him. And I watched him there, in the makeshift studio we built bit by bit, bent over the wood with that same serene focus. He didn't chase the spotlight. He just did what he loved. And maybe because of that he touched so many. Sometimes he teased that I was getting big again, with that half-provocative, half-proud smile. But I knew this time was different. I wasn't returning a throne. I was creating my own space, with my hands, my voice, my soul. The city that once scorned me began to shift its gaze. Some still whispered, of course, but many started approaching with genuine respect. People who knew me only as a symbol began to see the person behind the name. And Liam, once called her mistake, became seen as the man who helped me become who I am. But we knew he hadn't saved me, nor I him. We just walked together, and that made all the difference. The years passed with the lightness of a well-written book, not perfect, not free of pain, but with purpose in every line. And it was thus living among conscious choices and small daily joys that I found what many call a happy ending. Though I don't see it as an ending, but as a quiet fullness, like a breath finally released after being held too long. Liam and I grew old together in complicit silence, without needing public vows or spectacular ceremonies. We never wore golden rings, but our gestures said everything. The touch of a hand on a shoulder during a tough day. The glance across the room when a shared memory surfaced. The way he listened to me, even when I said nothing. We weren't the perfect couple, but we were real. And there was something deeply sacred in that. One day, while sorting through an old box of newspaper clippings, invitations and letters from the time I still carried the Diaraga name with wounded pride, I realized I no longer felt pain. I felt gratitude. Because it was that rigid, rule-filled world that taught me the value of what I live today. It was because of everything I lost that I could understand what truly matters. And looking at that box, I felt a deep peace. I was no longer the young woman who needed to prove something to the world. I had built a place where I could simply be. Years later, I was invited back to my family's old foundation, not as a lost daughter, nor as a symbol, but as a woman who inspired others. I declined politely, not out of pride, but because I knew that invitation wasn't for me. It was for the shadow of who I'd been. And I no longer lived there. My place was now beside Liam, on the benches of the community library, in the humble halls where women shared their stories, in the eyes of young people who saw in me not a last name, but a choice. And today, when I walk the streets and hear whispers or see surprised faces recognizing me, I smile with serenity. Because there's no greater victory than looking back and knowing you wrote your own story. Not because you were allowed to, but because you had the courage to pick up the pen with your own hands. I was raised to be a princess. I became a woman when I chose to leave the palace, but it was when I learned to love without shame, without fear, without a frame, that I discovered what it truly means to be free, and that was my greatest inheritance. I never thought my life would be made of silence, not the silence of repression, the kind I lived with for so long between gilded walls, but the silence of peace, of the quiet of someone who no longer needs to prove anything. Today I live with Liam in a house we restored ourselves, with old wood and new dreams. There are no titles hanging over my name anymore, but every person who calls me Diana does so with genuine affection. Sometimes young people write to me saying they heard my story and found the courage to choose their own paths. Sometimes women embrace me with tear-filled eyes because they found in me a reflection of what they were forced to abandon. And in those moments, I just smile, because I understand that true royalty isn't in the blood, it's in the courage. And I, daughter of an empire, only became a queen when I learned to rule my own heart.